Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today is day 2 of my Halloween week of videos, and today I'm going to talk about the film Cat People from 1942. Cat People is made by RKO, and the date of this film is very important to how it was made because RKO was not doing well financially after having the financial disaster that was Citizen Kane and their Orson Welles contract that they signed with him after doing the infamous War of the Worlds radio broadcast. Citizen Kane is certainly more of a financial success nowadays and very well known, but William Randolph Hearst basically ruined its financial future completely. It didn't really do that well despite getting a bunch of Oscar nominations and being well regarded, but it didn't become the classic and the big film it would until much later. And RKO desperately needed a hit. They were in bad financial shape then, and they turned to producer Val Lewton and asked him if he would produce horror films where they would just give him the title and he would have to make a film around that title. And this was the first film to do that. Cat People is kind of similar to low-budget horror films in the post-Halloween era, in which they only had 17 days to shoot this. They shot it mostly on sets that were used for previous films, particularly The Magnificent Ambersons. They shot it very quickly in 17 days and actually were shooting around the clock sometimes, having cameramen shoot at both day and night so they could get as much as they could. And having it be low budget, they couldn't do what Universal was doing at the time with their horror films. They were doing big budget, what would be kind of considered blockbuster horror films at the time. They either could get a star or put fancy makeup on them. Even though those horror films used suggestion as well, they didn't use it as much as Cat People did and didn't need to use it as much as Cat People did. Cat People and RKO simply just didn't have the money to make a Universal horror film. And that's what made Cat People so successful, much like how if you look at a lot of low budget horror films that become phenomenons and become hits, and it's interesting how much of its blueprint would go on later in 80s horror and low budget horror. If you look at everything from Jaws to Halloween to the Blair Witch Project, they all have the influence of Cat People. And a lot of horror films used suggestion because you couldn't be as gory as certainly you can now or in horror stories at the time. So you had to use a little bit of suggestion, but none used it as frequently and as intensely as Cat People did that 40s film-going audiences just simply weren't used to at the time, making Cat People a major hit and bringing RKO out of a big financial crisis. A young Serbian woman named Irena who falls in love with a young handsome architect at the zoo where she is watching various big jungle cats, and they start a relationship after they go back to her place for tea, and then they soon become engaged. She tells him a story about the women in her village and how if they become sexually aroused or jealous of another lover, they can transform into cat people and kill them, and so she doesn't want to consummate their marriage or even kiss him because she's afraid of what will happen to her. This causes her young architect husband to send her to a therapist and try to do right, but unfortunately her young architect husband has tired of being sexually frustrated, I guess, and not really being able to get along with his new spouse, so he falls in love with the girl at his office, Alice, and then Irena has to deal with that, and it looks like Irena is slowly trying to get her revenge as many creepy and intense sequences happen where Alice is afraid for her life because she swears there's a giant cat following her from the shadows. Val Lewton, who no one's really sure with a lot of Val Lewton films, apparently he didn't like to credit himself a lot, but he was an author, a poet, and a newspaper reporter, I think, at certain points. He didn't like to give himself credit, but apparently he had more to do with Cat People than he's let on. Apparently his two biggest phobias were being touched by people and cats. I would definitely say he had something to do with coming up with the plot of this film. Val Lewton was really good at using the directors to his advantage and using the little budget and going off and making his own kind of films that were different from what Universal was doing, and it gave RKO kind of its own house style. That was really how studios worked back then. Each studio had their own style, and Val Lewton got that to work for RKO. Even though it was really Val Lewton's thing, it's like kind of a branch of RKO. I think Universal was really a studio mandated one. This was just kind of like, here's the title, kid, go off and do it. But he was at RKO, and he seemed to work with the director Jacques Tourneur and the cinematographer Nicolas Masakurka, I'm butchering all of that, but would go on to collaborate later on Out of the Past, but this was, I believe, I don't know if it was their first film, but it was definitely the first major hit. And how they use shadow and lighting in this film is quite extraordinary. A lot of people say there's a big Citizen Kane influence on this film, and although it was edited by the same guy who edited Citizen Kane, Mark Robson, and it is incredibly well edited. If you look at some of the intense sequences, that would not work as well if you didn't have such an amazing editor like Mark Robson, who had just worked on Citizen Kane. I like how this film is shot a lot because it adds a lot to the mood and the tone of it, and it gives it an eerie feeling that I think a lot of films at this time would try to have through expensive sets and through makeup, but this film does it so much more effectively. There's a lot of shots in this film where the intense white and black, the intensity of the light in some of these shots, especially where they're at the architect's office and they have those light tables and only the light tables are on, that such beautiful shots with those light tables. The lighting in this film, the psychiatrist knocking over a lamp, or even the infamous pool scene, the way they use the lighting makes it even scarier and more intense. It's not just because it's so radical and beautiful, it's also because what it says about the story, what it says about the storytelling, and how it affects the mood so much. A lot of people note that one of the biggest influences on Cat People is German Expressionism. I kind of agree with that. German Expressionism had an influence on film noir. Obviously, Jacques Tourneur, who would work on Out of the Past, is considered one of the greatest film noirs of all time. It is kind of like a film noir horror film in a little bit of a way. Certainly the way it's shot, I don't really think so much about the story. It does have that feeling, and you can tell it's of that era. I love Simone in this film. She has a face like a little kitten. Obviously they play into that, and that's why they casted her. Actually, she has such an interesting performance because she feels so different. Everyone else is so all-American in this film, and then you have someone who, I'm not sure her actual ethnicity, but this immigrant coming in, and her voice sounds different, the way about her is different, and it works for Cat People because someone being different in this situation and in this story works because you get that she's from a strange land that these people don't understand, and talking about her village and its strange customs and its satanic history. Simone even says in interviews she never had as good of a part as this film, and it's kind of a shame. I think she's really good. She would be in Curse of the Cat People, but I haven't seen her be as good as she was in this film, and she's really magnificent. Her performance is like a cat. Even sometimes the way she lays down or sits behind a couch, she really acts like a cat. She has that way about her. It's a really smart performance because the more times I see it, I go, oh, the way her hand is like a cat's paw. The way she's moving this way is like how a cat would do this. I haven't read too much about how she consciously thought about that, but it works so well that it makes it memorable. That if you're wondering like, oh, she doesn't really transform into a cat, the way she moves, it kind of steers you in that direction. If someone wasn't playing it like that, it would be harder to swallow. I've heard people call it like a psychological horror film. I actually kind of agree with that, but it's still like a B movie, but it's a very smart B movie. It sometimes spells things out for you so much it's ridiculous and you consider it kind of like insulting, but then you look at what it's hiding from you and what it's just suggesting, and there's even more there. A lot of films at this time had to use suggestion, but Cat People has so much there. Sexual frustration, fear of sexuality, a fear of touching, the idea that you never really see this woman turn into a cat, and it's the main scary thing in this movie. There's only really 3 scenes, 2 of which I'm sure you can find the clips of on YouTube or in any history of horror documentary. Probably the most intense scene is her walking to the bus alone, and you just get through sound and through editing that something is behind Alice. And that part in the pool, especially when she screams, that echoing, you feel like there's something there in both times, and there's like a suggestion of something. Each time there's a little bit more of a suggestion, but you never really see it. How this film plays with you and plays with your fears. This film played for so long, apparently critics who didn't like it re-saw it and liked it a lot more. And I have to say, as I've watched this a couple times before reviewing this, it does sink in sometimes, these intense scenes, even though I know what's coming. The more times I see some of these sequences, it freaks me out even more because I know when that sound with the bus comes, or when she screams in that echo throughout the pool, the chill goes up my spine. I feel like it's gotten creepier the more times I've seen this film, and I've seen this film quite a few times. I do also think what this film says about feminism and how Alice, who has a job and is, I guess, more of an independent woman, and Irena, who doesn't seem to have a job, it kind of feels like what would go on in the Halloween era where you'd have the good girl who would survive and the girls who would smoke weed or drink beer or have sex would be killed. It's like she's defending matrimony and this whole idea of being this good woman versus this woman who is hanging out with the men and going out and knows things about the city. I don't really agree with those morals, but that's something that's always in horror, this judgmental attitude towards sexuality, almost a very conservative view of sexuality, which Cat People kind of falls in line with that tradition. I think that's probably one of the reasons Cat People has lived on for so long. Although certain directors like John Carpenter thinks it's kind of overrated, the similarities between this film helped it live on. I can't think of any of the Val Lewton films that really live on as much as Cat People, and he produced about 9 films in total. They're all really good 40s horror films from RKO, but Cat People I think lives on because of its similarities and because also its strong influence on what would happen throughout horror and what still happens to this day. I think Cat People has left its scent all over the horror genre, and I don't think we'll ever really be able to get it out because it feeds into those essential parts of horror movies, just like the films that influence. Those essential things that make us scared and jump up in the night and look behind us while we're walking in the bus in an alley by ourselves. And I think that's what's made Cat People such an enduring classic and still a pretty fucking scary movie. So if you have seen Cat People and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. Come back tomorrow for day 3 of my Halloween week of videos. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.